Today's hearing of the Subcommittee of Housing, Transportation, and Community Development will come to order. The hearing will be in virtual format. This is my first hearing as chair of the subcommittee, and I'm so glad to be joined by Ranking Member Rounds from South Dakota. Senator Rounds and I have worked together on Native housing issues for several years, and when we started talking earlier this year about our shared interest in this subcommittee, Native housing issues immediately came to mind as a topic for both of us. So I'm looking forward to working with Senator Rounds on this subcommittee, this Congress, as we examine a number of important housing, transportation, and community development issues. We're joined today by a panel of witnesses who will share their work to address housing insecurity in Native communities and their experiences with federal Indian housing programs. And this topic is personal to me. Minnesota is home to 11 sovereign tribal nations and large indigenous populations in the Twin Cities, Duluth, and Bemidji. And I've had the great privilege of visiting and meeting with tribal leaders from Minnesota to hear firsthand what they see as challenges and opportunities in their communities. And in 2019, I held a statewide listening tour on housing issues. And as part of that tour, we held 4 tribal-specific sessions. A consistent message that I heard across all 4 listening sessions with Native leaders was the need for more supportive housing and culturally specific programming, particularly to support Native people experiencing homelessness. Current and historical trauma amongst Native Americans contributes to the disproportionately high prevalence of homelessness amongst these communities. And they told me that without culturally specific programming and trauma-informed care, this won't work. Native people experiencing homelessness struggle to access services, of course, and to maintain housing stability. It's a difficult challenge, and tribal leaders are using scarce resources to try to address the complicated challenges of overcrowded homes, cost-burdened renters, and low home ownership rates on tribal lands. Consider that in Minnesota, 49% of Native households own their own homes, compared to 76% of white households. Nationally, this home ownership disparity exists as well, with about 51% of Native households owning a home compared to about 73% of white households. Home ownership requires access to credit, but in 2019, lenders in Minnesota denied almost 25% of Native American mortgage applications. By contrast, lenders denied only 6% of white applicants. Inequities in mortgage lending are only one factor contributing to disparities in home ownership. We also know that legal barriers to lending on trust land, a lack of intergenerational wealth, and underinvestment in federal Indian housing programs is also an issue. In this hearing, we have a platform to elevate the voices of those struggling with housing insecurity and those working to combat it in communities from Fond du Lac, Minnesota, to the Pine Ridge Reservations in South Dakota, to Montana, Nevada, and all over the country. The last time the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee held a hearing dedicated to these issues was during the 112th Congress, when fewer than half of the members of the subcommittee were even members of the Senate. I'm hopeful that today presents an opportunity for this committee to rededicate ourselves to meeting the treaty and moral obligations of our nation when it comes to ensuring that Native Americans have access to safe, affordable, and stable housing. We have a once-in-a-generation moment to address the deep systemic barriers in housing in Indian country, and I hope that you all will join me in this effort. Together, we can help Native families across the country secure safe, stable, and affordable housing. And we can finally give tribes the resources that they need, resources that they are already owed, so that we can find solutions that work in community. It is on us to prove to tribal nations that the federal government is ready to live up to its commitments and to play a role in reducing homelessness, providing housing assistance, and reducing disparities in home ownership. Before I turn to Senator Rounds, I'd just like to say a brief word about how I view the work of this subcommittee. Housing and transportation issues, we know, touch the lives of every single American. If you don't have a safe, affordable place to live, nothing else in your life works. It's nearly impossible to focus on your education, your job, or your family if you don't have a good, stable place to live. And if you can't get where you need to go safely, affordably, and reliably, it's pretty hard for anything else in your life to work either. Right now, too many families are struggling to find affordable housing and to get access to transportation, especially families of color and Native people. This has happened for a range of reasons: the history of unfair and inequitable federal housing policies, lack of funding, and a lack of understanding, sometimes just a lack of attention. So I intend to use this subcommittee to examine these issues and to do all that we can to make sure that housing and transit policies work for all families. I can't wait to roll up my sleeves and to get to work, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and from the members of this subcommittee. And now I'll turn to Senator Rounds for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to attend today's hearing. I look forward to hearing from all of you. Let me just begin, though, by thanking the chair. Senator Smith and I are not only working on housing issues, we're working on a number of the rural areas, and sometimes that's not something that we talk about with regard to items that make news in the, in the headlines or anything. But there's a lot of us that try to work across the lines back and forth, and in the Senate it requires bipartisan support for any type of activity to move forward. And Senator Smith and I are working on ag issues, we're working on water development issues, rural economic issues, and this is an area that, as the chairwoman has said, this is an area that we both agree is a place where we really can make a difference in our home states and for rural parts of our country. Today, this committee will examine an issue of great importance to me and to so many in my home state of South Dakota, and one that this committee has not held a hearing on in nearly 10 years. That issue is providing safe, affordable, and stable housing for Native American communities throughout the United States. I hope this is one of multiple opportunities that we'll have to address this matter, this Congress, and work together across the aisle on solutions to the policy challenges in this area. This issue not only impacts the lives of thousands of South Dakotans, but also millions more of our tribal members across the United States. In South Dakota, we have 9 federally recognized tribes, each of which faces various and unique tribal housing concerns. One of these tribes is represented here today, and I'd like to introduce Mr. Eric Shepard from the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Wahpeton in South Dakota. Eric, thank you for being with us today. You might want to just wave at everybody, Eric. Recent data shows that housing conditions for Native American households are substantially worse than U.S. households. In fact, Native Americans have some of the greatest housing needs in the United States. That's according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. The reasons for this being they face overcrowding, high poverty rates, lack of plumbing, inadequate heating, and other severe infrastructure issues. And that is if they're even able to access housing options at all. This is a serious problem, and now is the time to fix it. In addition, there are other fundamental challenges that make homeownership more difficult for Native Americans. The complicated legal nature of tribal trust land can make it exponentially more difficult to lend and borrow on land in Indian country. Now, legislation that Senator Smith and I partnered on in the past has resolved a number of complications, but there is clearly more work to do. The FDIC also reports that Native American and Alaska Native American individuals are unbanked at triple the average of other Americans. Not having access to financial services makes owning and even renting a home all that much more difficult. I hope today's hearing will also shed light into how housing challenges are exacerbated by other legal and economic issues. Even before COVID-19 pandemic, Native American housing programs already in existence have failed to adequately serve the needs of our poorest tribal communities, especially in more rural areas across the country. It is my hope that Congress can also make progress this year on reauthorization of the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, or Usda. And I look forward to hearing our witnesses' thoughts on reauthorizations, reforms, and alternative funding options for Native housing in light of the recent pandemic. These past few months, the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed more Native Americans living on reservations to seek home ownership, but long-standing barriers continue to prevent this. That is why I partnered together once again with Senator Smith on two pieces of legislation, including the Native American Housing Affordability Act and legislation reforming the Native American Direct Lending Program, both of which I'm looking forward to discussing today. For years, Congress and tribal leaders have worked to address these Native American housing issues. There have been a range of different approaches and challenges, and we seem to have fallen short along the way. While these issues are complex and compounded when put into rural settings, there is no excuse for the situation which so many of our tribal members face every single day, just by being or wanting to be at home. It's time that we make a concerted effort of stakeholders and in consultation with our tribal members to develop solutions that meet the needs of our state's growing tribal communities. Again, we welcome all of you here today and look forward to hearing your testimony about this very important issue. And I thank you for attending and participating. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Senator Rounds. I am now going to introduce our witnesses. I will introduce all 5 witnesses and then turn to each of you to make your opening statements. We have with us today Dante Desiderio, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Congress of American Indians, Adrian Stevens, the Acting Board Chair of the National American Indian Housing Council, and also the Executive Director of the Seneca National Housing Authority and a member of the Seneca Nation. Aline Churamoff, the Senior Vice President for Community Development and the Center for Indian Country Development at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. Michael Gozzi, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Indian Community Development Corporation in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and also the Chair of the Board of the Commissioners, the Chair of the Board of Commissioners of the Ho-Chunk Housing and Community Development Agency, and a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. Greetings to my fellow Minnesotans. And also Eric Shepard, the Executive Director of the Sisseton Wahpeton Housing Authority in Sisseton, South Dakota. Eric is also a member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate community. Welcome and thank all of you for your willingness to speak with us today, and I look forward to hearing from each of you. Before you begin your opening statements, just a few reminders. Once you start speaking, there will be a slight delay before you are displayed on the screen. To minimize background noise, please click the mute button until it's your turn to speak or ask questions. You should have all on your screens a box labeled clock that will show you how much time you have remaining. And for witnesses, I ask you to please keep your opening statements to about 5 minutes. You will have the opportunity to have your full written statement submitted as part of the record. For all senators, the 5-minute clock applies to your questions also. When you have 30 seconds remaining for your statements or questions, you will hear a bell ring to remind you that your time is almost expired, and it will ring again when your time has expired. And if there is a technology issue, we'll just move to the next witness or senator until that technology issue is resolved. And to simplify the speaking order, Senator Rounds and I have agreed to go by seniority in this hearing. And I will now turn to Mr. Desiderio for your opening statements.
Thank you, Senator, and good morning, Chairwoman Smith and Ranking Member Rounds and members of the Subcommittee on Housing, Transportation, and Community Development. This is quite an honor to be present in the Senate Banking Committee. On behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, as the Chief Executive Officer, I'm Dante Desiderio, a member of the Saponi tribe. And we represent the largest and oldest organization comprised of sovereign tribal nations and their citizens. So tribal nations across the country aim to maintain housing infrastructure that improves their citizens' health outcomes, sustains their regional economy, and importantly addresses the growing population with our tribes. And I do want to just comment for a second on the idea, Chairwoman Smith, of taking a listening tour in Indian country. It's the best way to learn about Indian country. And Senator Rounds, I agree that now is the time to fix it. So for decades, the federal government has recognized its trust responsibility to tribal nations to provide adequate housing that's been chronically underfunded. And as a result, our tribal communities see overcrowded homes, at a rate roughly 8 times the national average, and over 70% of our existing housing requires extensive upgrades and repairs. In 2017, HUD reported that it will take approximately 68,000 new units to alleviate overcrowding and replace those in grave condition. These disparities increase the vulnerability of American Indians and Alaskan Natives to the COVID-19 pandemic and resulted in our community having at times the highest infection, hospitalization, and death rates per capita in the United States. Today, my testimony will focus on impediments and barriers facing tribal nations and tribally designated housing entities when attempting to build and finance housing. Then I'll turn to recommendations that will allow for construction and financing of housing on tribal lands. First, I want to address the challenges and barriers of lending on trust lands and the burdensome permitting process. In 2019, the FDIC found that 16% of tribal households were unbanked, compared to only 5% of the general population. The unique status of trust lands and the lack of education of most private lenders makes them reluctant to lend to either individual natives, tribal nations, and tribally designated housing entities. Further exacerbating this issue, the BIA must review all trust land leases and provide verification of ownership, which can be delayed for months. Second, there's a lack of access to housing tax credits for multifamily housing units in Indian country. These tax credits are only provided to state governments, who in turn have the ability to offer those to tribal nations, but often do not, or if they do, it's sporadic. And third, while construction costs and inflation continue to rise, flat federal funding on Indian housing program results in a sharp decrease in the amount of affordable housing units. And finally, while identifying barriers is helpful in understanding challenges, it doesn't always offer a pathway forward for creating policy solutions. So I want to offer a few solutions. One, Congress should increase the access to the low-income housing tax credit program and provide tax credits at a proportionate rate for tribal governments. Second, Congress should support finalizing the implementation of the most recent CRA proposed rules and encourage other banking oversight entities to adopt similar rules. Third, Congress should create a $50 million tribal allocation from the USDA 502 direct lending program to get capital into Indian country and expand the test program that was done in South Dakota. And lastly, while outside the jurisdiction of this committee, Congress should reauthorize the NAHASDA and fully fund NAHASDA. NAHASDA would authorize two important home loan programs, the Title VI Loan Guarantee Program and the Section 184 Loan Guarantee Program. And when drafting this legislation, National Congress of American Indians urges Congress to establish an Assistant Secretary for Indian Housing at the Housing and Urban Development that would streamline environmental rules, allow tribal housing programs to access IHS sanitation funding, and Congress should also permanently authorize tribal HUD Veterans Assistant Program to ensure all Native veterans receive the benefits they deserve. And just in conclusion, if Congress does not act, existing tribal housing will continue to deteriorate, and tribes will be left vulnerable as they have been in this, as we've all seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much for allowing me to testify.
Thank you so much. And we will now turn to Mr. Stevens.
Good morning. My name is Adrian Stevens, and I'm the acting chair of the board of directors of the National American Indian Housing Council. I am a member of the Seneca Nation in New York, and I currently serve as executive director of the Seneca Nation Housing Authority. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the Senate Banking Subcommittee today to discuss tribal housing. I would like to thank Chairwoman Smith, Ranking Member Rounds, and committee members for having this hearing. In addition to the comments I will make today, I have submitted a formal written statement for the record. The committee asked us to describe the state of housing in Indian country. Unfortunately, the answer is that unmet housing needs in our tribal community are great and they are persistent. There is a long-standing housing shortage across Indian country due to years of stagnant investment. Tribal housing programs rely on federal funding through the Usda, which established the Indian Housing Block Grant for tribes 25 years ago. Funding for the Usda programs has been flat for nearly 20 years, providing tribes only 2/3 the purchasing power today that the Usda funds provided in the 1990s. And we are asking tribes to do a lot with their housing dollars each year. Tribes are tasked with managing existing housing stock that have been developed over decades, and now it's often aging and needing constant repairs. We ask tribes to also provide low-income rental assistance, provide student housing, housing and supportive services for elders and veterans, housing counseling services for future homeowners, and we expect them to build new housing units each year. Tribes are expected to carry out all these services when nearly 400 of the Indian Housing Block Grant recipients receive less than $500,000 a year to do so, and 175 tribal communities receive less than $100,000 a year for their housing programs. To be clear, Usda has been successful. It has provided tribes dedicated and consistent funding each year, enabling tribal housing programs to improve their capacity and ability to improve their communities. Tribal housing programs have never been capable to provide housing services to the communities, and that is due to the Usda. When we fall short is the lack of investments to spur new housing development in Indian country. In the first decade of the Usda, tribes were building well over 2,000 units a year across the country, more than had been built annually before the Usda was enacted. New construction has significantly decreased, however, as funding diminishes with inflation each year. Currently, tribes are building or purchasing roughly 1,000 units a year, while a 2017 HUD report found that 68,000 units are needed to address overcrowded homes and substandard housing in tribal communities. Unless we change how we invest in housing development in Indian country, tribes will not catch up. Prior to the Usda, tribes were piecing their housing programs together with various grants and funding sources. Despite the original promise of the block grant, tribes are again today piecing their housing programs together. Tribes are leveraging resources and programs from the U.S. Treasury, USDA, Veterans Affairs, non-tribal HUD programs, and others. However, as tribes put these pieces together, they are often confronted with a multitude of different eligibility requirements, environmental reviews, and program rules. As project planning becomes more complex due to leveraging multiple funding sources, tribes must weigh each project's impact and determine the best use of their staff's time and bandwidth. So what can we do, and what can Congress do? First and foremost, we need to reauthorize and properly fund the Usda programs. The Usda provides the greatest flexibility for tribes to meet unique housing needs of their communities, and when properly funded, we see new unit development across Indian country. We have to encourage commercial lending and investment through direct tax credits and incentives. Too often, private banks and lenders avoid tribal communities because the perception is that projects are too complex or they don't provide the same efficient return on investment that a similar project in a non-tribal area would provide. We have to improve administrative of trust land and how delays in simple trust land documentation deter banks and government lenders alike from prioritizing housing loans on trust lands. We have to demand that all federal housing programs include tribal communities in both eligibility and implementation. Low-income housing tax credit, USDA rural housing, housing trust fund, and other programs all seem like ideal fits to solve tribal housing issues, yet those resources impact tribal communities sparingly across the country, if at all. We have seen promise in federal and state programs that prioritize or incentivize tribal areas or create specific set-asides. And we see promise when a federal program that is nationally in scope, like the USDA Single-Family Home Loan Program, partners directly with tribal organizations, market and implement their federal programs directly in tribal communities. In that USDA pilot program in South Dakota, we have seen native CDFIs issue more USDA-backed home loans in true tribal communities in the single year than USDA was able to provide in the past decade. So let's do more of that. In short, we have to increase investments of dollars and effort from Congress, from federal agencies, from tribes, from the private sector. We must recognize the real nature of many communities. The small size of many tribal communities, the higher cost of project development in tribal communities all factor together to diminish the economies of scale that drive housing development. And we have to invest anyway because it is needed in our tribal communities where our families continue to face greater levels of overcrowded and substandard homes and lack of affordable housing options. With that, I will end my statement and look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you again for your support in improving the housing opportunities for Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiians across the United States.
Thank you very much. I'll turn now to Aline Chirma.
Thank you, Chair Smith, Ranking Member Rounds, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. As the Senior Vice President of Community Development and Engagement at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, I oversee the work of the Center for Indian Country Development. The CICD supports tribes through actionable research and community collaboration to further tribal economic prosperity, and also leverages our department's broader expertise on affordable housing, labor markets, and early childhood development. I should add today that my views that I express here are not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. Our work on housing involves applied research, community engagement, and constant attention to the economic literature in the field. Our work points to the harmful effects of the current state of housing for Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and other Indigenous populations. My comments and detailed written testimony focus on Indian country specific housing challenges and opportunities demonstrated by Indian country's leaders. As you've already heard this morning, housing is often in short supply and it's substandard conditions in Indian country. Homes are 7 times more likely to be crowded and nearly 4 times more likely to lack complete plumbing. These conditions have been shown to harm family health and stability. In 2017, HUD estimated that 68,000 units would be needed just to address these issues, which would likely cost tens of billions of dollars. We focus on 5 factors that reinforce these barriers. First, Native nations are sovereign, but their land is held in trust and must have its title cleared by the U.S. government. Mortgages on trust land are also leasehold mortgages as opposed to fee simple mortgages, and housing professionals and homebuyers frequently identify these hurdles as significant. Second, Indian country home buyers often face an uphill battle working with lenders to finance their home. Our economists' work shows that Native American borrowers on tribal lands are more likely to receive high-cost loans, leaving them ultimately to pay more for their homes over the life of their mortgage. Third, the tools designed to work in Indian country are often underutilized on trust land. So this applies to Indian country specific products like HUD's Section 184 program, but it's also true of products whose features make them relevant in Indian country, like the USDA's Section 502 program. The fourth reason relates to the federal government's failure to fulfill treaty obligations. Developments in Indian country often pay today for the resulting historical underinvestment in physical infrastructure. So, for example, poor access to water or transportation raises the overall cost of construction. Fifth, federal funding sources with different eligibility requirements and process requirements complicate the pre-construction process in and may not reflect the unique needs of Indian country. No quick fixes will radically improve things overnight, but there are plenty of innovations that show promise for a brighter future and present potential avenues for involvement for Congress. Our research and engagement suggest 4 recommendations. First, the federal government should continue to expand financial capacity of Native community community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and other tribal institutions. Native CDFIs offer community-grounded credit solutions in Indian country, and our research suggests that the presence and activities of Native CDFIs increases the credit score of Indian country residents that previously had the lowest credit scores. And the pilot that was just mentioned involving 2 Native CDFIs and the USDA in South Dakota has shown the power of connecting community-based lenders and federal lending resources. Second, the federal government can create normalized and complementary interagency lending processes in Indian country. So we recommend that federal agencies and government-sponsored enterprises work with representatives from tribal governments, lenders, developers, and nonprofits to find solutions and provide guidance for housing in Indian country. Third, an improved title process on trust land would support housing development and tribal sovereignty. The Helping Expedite and Advance Responsible Tribal Homeownership, also known as the Hearth Act of 2012, created a process for tribes to assume additional control of trust land management. But sufficient funding is not available through the Hearth Act itself to fund the administrative capacity necessary for taking over trust land management from the BIA, and that cost is simply too high for many tribes. Finally, data on Native Americans and Indian country programs should be improved. With some exceptions, existing sources are often insufficient to assess policy impacts or changes in the population level well-being. So illuminating economic conditions in Indian country will require collaboration on methodologies and new financial resources to obtain sufficient statistical samples. Congress has recently taken steps to support tribal sovereignty and access to important housing resources, and I hope our testimony today provides insight into how federal policy can further support and accelerate Indian country's upward momentum. I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to share insights from CICD's work.
Thank you very much. I'll turn now to Mr. Gozzi.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Senator Rounds, and the members of the subcommittee. It's my honor to provide testimony to this committee this morning in looking at the current situation regarding safe, standard, and affordable housing on tribal trust land or within rural or urban settings throughout our country. American Indians fall far short of the national average in the percentage of home ownership when compared to their white counterparts. There are several reasons for this disparity. First, access to mortgage products that meet the specific needs of the American Indian population. The Section 184 Indian Home Loan Guarantee Program is a home mortgage product specifically designed for American Indian, Alaskan Native families, Alaskan villages, tribes, and tribally designated housing entities. Congress established this program in 1992 to facilitate and increase access to capital in American Indian communities. Although this mortgage product has had some impact, it has not equaled the playing field. The number of lending institutions that offer the Section 184 loan product are limited to a select few. I would suggest that the Section 184 or a like loan product would be better served if provided through American Indian Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFIs, that are a great asset to the Indian country, both on reservations and in urban areas. The CDFIs provide a myriad of services, all dedicated to the financial success of its clients. The work of the CDFI in home ownership is providing homebuyer education, homebuyer counseling, credit repair, budgeting, responsibilities of home ownership, and other aspects of this sometimes daunting process. A large number of American Indian clients seeking home ownership are first-time homeowners looking to provide stability, enhancing the community stabilization, making these services important to their individual success. I believe this relationship would benefit through the mortgage process. Currently, their clients make applications for mortgages with other lending institutions. Sometimes these are online application, and this can be a totally different experience than they've had in the past in working with the CDFI. To provide an opportunity for American Indian CDFIs to have a mortgage product like the Section 184 will complete the process and provide a greater level of success. American Indian CDFIs, given the opportunity, could provide a better level of service, gain the knowledge and financial benefits of the mortgage process, making this a win-win for both the clients and the CDFI. Secondly, affordability. Income levels within Native American communities have a substantial effect on the home loan amount available to them. In today's housing prices, the availability of homes are scarce in lower price areas. Having a forgivable deferred loan product will reduce over time, will be a great investment to the stabilization of American Indian families and communities. Having a safe, standard, and affordable home creates the foundation that promotes better outcomes in areas of education, health, and financial stability. Our homes can be the single greatest financial asset in one's life, making way for families to continue to thrive versus just survive in the current economic climate. By investing in our American Indian families via home ownership, we can create an immediate impact to the lives of our youth, elders, and adults. This type of investment creates immediate impact and also provides long-term impact in the stabilization of families. Thirdly, a land trust model. We have used the land trust model in Minneapolis to make homeownership more affordable. You know, in Minneapolis, we have much success in this and reducing the mortgage loan amount by having land owned through a land trust. This provides the ability to create the buying power of the homeowner and by having the land held outside of the mortgage. It provides a monthly benefit to the homeowner in a reduced monthly payment. In the land trust model, the appreciation is shared by a predetermined amount so that should the property be sold. The land trust model can also be beneficial in continued housing affordability for the community by reinvestment of the appreciation by the land trust. Lastly, in today's times, we need to use every financial opportunity to help American Indian families understand and relish in the benefits of home ownership. We need to use a number of initiatives to make home ownership possible. At AICDC, we have used city, county, and state funding options, including grants, deferred loans, and other homeownership initiatives. And this has made, we look forward to our federal partners in providing opportunities to increase homeownership to American Indian families throughout the country. I thank you for your attention to this matter.
Thank you very much. And we'll now turn to Mr. Shepard.
I'd like to thank Madam Smith for the opportunity to speak, Vice Chairman Toomey, Senator Rounds, and other members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to talk about Indian housing today. It has been an especially hard and challenging 15 months for those of us on the Sisseton Wahpeton Reservation in South Dakota. We were hit hard early with the COVID pandemic at home, and we are still working on recovery today. Housing has been at the forefront of the recovery efforts, providing a safe place for our members to shelter and recover and managing the many new relief programs that in Congress have provided to us. A large part of our recovery effort at Sisseton Wahpeton involves looking past the pandemic and into the long-term status of Indian housing programs. Both on our reservation and in the United States as a whole, the perennially inadequate funding and other program issues that existed prior to 2020 must now be addressed to assure the long-term sustainability of Indian housing for the First Americans. To put it more plainly, we all must understand something is wrong. When the base level appropriation for the Native American Indian Housing and Self-Determination Act, NAHASDA, has not been increased since the law was originally passed 25 years ago, as Congress and the new Biden administration focuses on helping American rebuild its dilapidated infrastructure and recalibrate its housing assistance programs. Indian country and Indian housing must also be given fair consideration. I know the subcommittee has a particular interest in the HUD Section 184 program. Operating in Indian country, I can tell you that the 184 program has had limited impact on reservation lands held in trust by the United States. While a few individuals have been able to secure leasehold mortgages under the program, most of the funds go to off-reservation lands in urban areas where banks and lenders are more comfortable with providing traditional mortgages. The situation has not helped with HUD recent revision of the program regulations that send the program back in time before the 184 Act was passed in 1992, requiring underwriting provisions and fees that are not affordable or helpful to developing new housing on reservation lands. I'd like to call the subcommittee's attention to a number of important issues that Congress should address regarding Indian housing programs. We appreciate the emergency funds received to date and needed to receive a fair share of the new housing infrastructure funds as well. The CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and the American Rescue Plan have all included much needed emergency funds to support Indian housing operations during the pandemic. We do appreciate that Congress has allocated money to alleviate the short-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. We can confirm that this money had an immediate and vital impact on preserving and protecting housing services and resources in our tribal communities. Our proposal to now address the more long-term and sustainable solutions to improving Indian housing, the recently proposed American Jobs Plan, includes $231 billion to improve and produce more housing and housing infrastructure, including a proposed amount of at least $50 billion to renovate, rehabilitate federally assisted housing. We are asking you to help ensure that if new infrastructure legislation is passed, Indian housing continue to get its fair share of the funding. A 5% set aside for Indian housing would be a $2.5 billion. As you are aware, federal programs have long negotiated Indian countries' need to maintain and improve its aging housing stock. Housing needs in tribal areas remain the most severe in the nation, and resources to address the problem have declined more rapidly than for other federal housing programs. 10 of thousands of new units are needed. Thousands of existing units, some which are currently boarded up because of lack of funding and severe methamphetamine contamination, are also in need of substantial rehabilitation. The simple fact is that $2.5 billion of additional new funding is needed. If these conditions are going to be effectively addressed, tribes and their TDHEs have the capacity to build and rehabilitate their housing. Most observers know, and most studies show, including the recent housing needs of American Indians and Alaskan Natives in tribal areas, a report from the Assessment of American Indian and Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian housing needs by HUD, PD&R, and the Urban Institute, January 2017, the report that TDHEs have, or if needed, can quickly reacquire the capacity to build housing and other related infrastructure construction on this scale. TDHEs are prepared to quickly gear up to produce a substantial number of new units. This will help tribes and Alaskan villages generate for their communities, the country post-pandemic economic recovery, just as they did successfully 10 years ago after the Great Recession and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the ARA tribes. Thank you for this time to testify.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. And we'll now begin a round of 5-minute questions from senators. And I will start actually right, I think, where Mr. Shepard was leaving off, which is the unique challenge that we have on with housing on tribal lands, which is that properties are far more likely to have really significant, severe physical defects than the rest of the United States housing stock all in. In fact, on tribal lands, plumbing is deficient at a rate 5 times higher than the national average, and homes on tribal lands lack heating at a rate of more than 100 times the national average. So let me maybe turn to Mr. Desiderio and Mr. Stevens, and you could just talk about why you think these physical challenges are so much pervasive on in tribal housing, and then let us know, is this primarily a funding issue, or are there other things that we need to be doing in order to address this deep challenge?
Well, I want to address go back in time a little bit to address this. There's this idea that tribes are have been placed on marginal lands. They have a limited land base, and the housing stock is not kept up with the demand. So when you're looking at building on limited land base with limited access to water and other infrastructure, the issues that you're mentioning tend to be more significant. It is an issue of funding, and I'm glad we're having this conversation around housing during a national conversation of what is infrastructure. And this isn't an isolated issue. So as we're talking about infrastructure, we really need to talk about the infrastructure needs that support housing, which is what you're getting at your question. If the housing stock isn't keeping up with the demand, and we have the highest number of family members per household, it stresses the existing housing stock, and then the limitations on funding of the water infrastructure, which has gone down, and also looking at our lands are not included in the Water Resources Conservation Act, which provides USDA with that type of planning authority. So there's a number of issues that go into this, but mostly on the marginal lands and the lack of ability to address the larger and really expensive infrastructure issues that go into forming a really a holistic community or holistic housing stock.
Yeah, thank you. So we should be thinking about this clearly in the context of this larger infrastructure conversation we're having. Mr. Stevens, would you like to add anything to that?
I think Dante hit it right on a knot there, really talking about the infrastructure issues and lack of funding. You know, rather than repeat what he said, he's pretty much stated what answering your question. But again, you know, the older the homes that we have on reservation are really one of the issues that we have, and you know, and finally being able to replace all the homes that we do have. And I think just having that availability of funding available. So
right. So let me turn to Mr. Gozzi. Mike, in the recovery from the coronavirus crisis, the community development CDFIs have played a really important role in providing financing to folks that have been overlooked by or unable to get access to financing. Could you just talk to us about what we need to do to help CDFIs support home ownership for Indigenous people, and what you've seen is most effective in accomplishing this goal from the perspective of CDFIs?
Well, AICD created a community development loan fund that actually is morphed into Minnesota Fund, which is the CDFI. It's a new CDFI. They chose not to enter into the PPP arena because of their size. But I see the CDFIs as being the most integral part of home ownership, especially in the urban areas and on the reservation areas, serving both in the urban area and working with the Ho-Chunk Community Development Agency in Wisconsin. I see the advantage of the CDFIs both in the urban and on the reservation in rural areas. And so I believe by supporting them with providing more products that they can use to reach their clients and tribal members would be advantageous, both in home ownership and actually all lending opportunities, which we see the Native American being unbanked and not being able to access some of the financial needs that they might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Stevens, I'm very interested in the USDA 502 loan pilot program in South Dakota. I expect that Senator Rounds will ask about that, but if he doesn't, I'll return to that. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I most certainly appreciate the fact that we're having this hearing today, and there seems to be a whole series of topics here that our panelists have already delved into. But let me just begin with this, and I'd like to direct this first one to Mr. Shepard. Although it doesn't fall squarely within the jurisdiction of the Banking Committee, I hope that Congress can make progress this year on the reauthorization of the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, or NAHASDA. NAHASDA is a very broad piece of legislation, but I was hoping to learn more about some of the priorities your organizations and tribes have identified for a reauthorization package. And Mr. Shepard, I know you have an interest in this, and that's the reason why I'm directed to you first. What are some of the key priorities that the Sisseton and Wahpeton Oyate is hoping to see when NAHASDA is reauthorized?
Thank you, Senator Rounds. In several other contexts, when tribes need approval from an agency, Congress has authorized the deemed approved approach to move a decision point past the agency. And if the agency takes too long to act, would you support this kind of approach in the context of HUD decision making under the NAHASDA? NAHASDA expired in 2013 and has not been reauthorized since, despite efforts in every session to do so. What obstacles of development, affordable housing, and lack are there improvements to the low-income housing areas? I think it's time. I think we need to change our mission there. We've been going 25 years now, Senator.
Yeah.
We've had multiple consultations with tribes coming to DC, and maybe it's more than once a year. We're getting past the pandemic now, and maybe it's time that it is time. Let's leave it at that. It is time to reauthorize NAHASDA.
Thank you. And I was thinking about this also, and I'm going to direct my next question to Mr. Desiderio. An article from the Billings Gazette recently referred to federal assistance for Indian country as the Marshall Plan for Indian country. It pointed out that the American Rescue Plan dedicated $36 billion to federally recognized tribes this year, on top of $8 billion from CARES. Given the scope of challenges when it comes to housing, I really hope that this money is being directed and that you're seeing it on the ground there. Can you tell us more about the effectiveness of how those funds are being transmitted through the bureaucracy, and whether or not it seems to be any effectiveness with regard to the federal assistance during the COVID-19 when it comes to housing specifically?
Right. Thank you for that, Senator. So the experience for tribes on the discretionary funds from the CARES Act should be separated a little bit from the American Rescue Plan. The CARES Act through the Department of Treasury had limitations on the use of the funds. So infrastructure was relatively limited for tribes to be able to pursue. The subsequent legislation opened up housing, had housing vouchers, and then in this latest round of the American Rescue Plan, infrastructure was included, but it wasn't housing. So we are able to address some of the water issues and the sanitation issues with the Rescue Act funding and get to some of the housing vouchers and housing assistance through some of the other legislation. So it's all incredibly helpful. And I think it serves as a model for putting out discretionary money, but the other side of that is opening the options for tribes to be able to address the dramatic infrastructure needs that have come out during this pandemic, and really showcased what deficiency in infrastructure, what are those real impacts. And so the Marshall Plan idea is great, and the discretionary funding is great, and we are looking forward to addressing some of the infrastructure needs. But we're also looking forward to further support through infrastructure funding to be able to open that discretionary funding up, or the programmatic funding up, to address all of these needs. I think that tying hands on discretionary money may not be the best use for addressing our needs on the ground that we all know firsthand in our communities.
Thank you. Let me just follow up, but I do want to follow up on Senator Smith's comments concerning the 502 direct lending program. And I know that we've got a pilot project working. I know there's more that we could do to help these programs function appropriately. And to Mr. Stevens, do you have any thoughts on how to improve and to build on the 502 program? Have we learned anything so far?
I really haven't had any issues or really any type of development with the 502 program here at Seneca. And again, you know, looking at that, I think really the openness of the regulations that you need to follow to go through that program are limited to what we try to do here on tribal lands. You know, it's tough. You know, they open that up, but it's very little usage of that funding available there is limited. So I think we can open it up and look at more consultation on how to utilize those funds a lot easier for tribes to be able to provide the housing needs of our communities. So.
Okay, well, thank you. And my time has expired, but perhaps we can explore that a little bit more later on here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to this panel. This is a great discussion. I'm very proud I get to represent 27 tribal communities in the state of Nevada. Let me start with the Federal Home Loan Bank investments. There are 11 government-sponsored enterprises that we know as the Federal Home Loan Banks, and they're required to meet the affordable housing and community development needs of the communities of the states that they serve. So my question to the panel members, how many tribes, to your knowledge, have received investments from the Federal Home Loan Bank programs like the Community Investment Program or the Community Investment Cash Advance or the Affordable Housing Program? I'm curious to know if the data here, and maybe is it Desiderio? We could start with you. Are you familiar with any of this money from federal home loan banks going to any of the tribal communities for housing?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And just to point out, the Federal Home Loan Bank has reached out to get Native representation from Senator Smith's home state, Chief Benjamin, from the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. Is going to be serving on that board. And they've had limited outreach as well to a CDFI technical organization. But in general, I don't know if I can answer the question on how many, but it really has been very limited outreach. If you look at the potential of the Federal Home Loan Bank, they have two different areas. One is on being able to reassure, provide liquidity to banks. There's a lot of Native American banks that could benefit from that. But on the other side of it, if you look at their plans and their limited plans, they're not addressing the real needs of Indian country. Just meeting with a CDFI technical advisor is not enough, and it doesn't go to the understanding of tribal issues and the capital needs that tribes are faced with. Senator Rounds bringing up the 502 program is a great example of the creativity of a program to be able to adjust to a member's income and lower the interest rate. It's also the ability to get direct funding for relending into communities. So all these things are possible, and they should serve as a model for the capital markets and not as a substitute. And I think that's really important. So the Federal Home Loan Bank, in providing some of the priorities for the bank, their plans for the bank, in being able to address Indian country needs, it has not acted in that direction. And the other thing that they can do is they have a lot of grants that could go out to tribal communities, but they're going out to serve housing needs in the same way, and not really using the tribal governments and their role in providing housing to their citizens. So $700 or $800 million in grant funding is not finding its way to reassure the capital markets or bring housing into Native communities.
Thank you. And is it fair to say the only reason that they've recently reached out is because Senator Smith has been engaged, but that's just, but prior to that, they had not reached out to you?
I think it's fair to say that, yes, they have not been actively reaching out until recently, yes.
Yeah, and that's what I'm finding as well as I engage in my region. And the reason I bring it up, because this is such an important issue. And so one of the areas that I'm focused on, and just for my colleagues, in 2019, there was a report on the low income housing and community development activities of the federal home loan banks. There was only one reference to investment in tribes. Only the Des Moines Bank offered a program, a Native American Homeownership Initiative. And I know, and this is the reason I'm bringing it up, because we all feel the same way, that we've got to do a better job here. So because of this, I recently introduced legislation, it's S1684. It's the Federal Home Loan Bank's Mission Implementation Act, which would strengthen the ability of the banks to invest in communities. And the bill, my bill includes a 2% set aside for tribes. This is an area that we've got a great opportunity to focus on. And I look forward to more conversations on this issue. But thank you for this great hearing.
Thank you so much, Senator Cortez Masto. Now, there's Senator Lummis. I'll next turn to Senator Lummis. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chairman, and Senator Rounds for holding this hearing. I'm going to focus my questions on the economically disadvantaged Native Americans. In my state, that includes a substantial number of the members of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes in Wyoming on the Wind River Reservation, and also, as you know, Senator Rounds, the Oglala Lakota at Pine Ridge, and there are issues that relate to housing that really do affect their financial and personal well-being. And I want to start with some questions about how the census may have inaccurately counted, because it's so difficult, the number of Native Americans, and how many are living in each household. You know, if you have a Native American household where there are multiple generations, there are extra workers, they're trying to keep everybody housed, perhaps in housing that is smaller than would normally be considered in the United States adequate for that many people, then the census comes along and maybe they're reluctant to discuss how many people are living in their household. So question number one, and I think this is for Mr. Desiderio and Ms. Churamoff. Is counting, is the census an issue, and is it contributing to undercounts?
So I just want to categorically say yes to that question, and just the idea that tribal communities are consistently undercounted in the census is pretty significant for the amount of funding that goes out to tribes. The reluctance, for tribal citizens to contribute to the census has always been an issue, and then this past census is going to have a severe impact on that because of the pandemic and because of the idea that a lot of tribes are in rural and remote areas, and this information needs face-to-face, and that hasn't been done as adequately in the last census. So yes, it's an important issue. The reluctance in the higher households, it's important that we get an accurate count, and I'm not sure we're doing that at this point.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I would also offer, I would agree with what Mr. Desiderio has just said. I think Native Americans are at risk of being under or miscounted, I think, for two important reasons. First, the American Community Survey, which provides annually updated data about reservations and communities across the country, doesn't include information about tribal enrollment. And so it can make it difficult to understand how housing challenges might vary across tribes, and renders the ACS less useful for program implementation than it could otherwise be. And it means that the population measured in the census data is not actually directly comparable to population measured in a tribal census, for example. The second challenge is, as Dante was just mentioning, that Native Americans are vulnerable to undercounting in the decennial census, and obviously by extension the ACS, and that's driven in part by the higher likelihood of renting, lack of infrastructure, potentially phones, maybe issues with trust in the federal government, access to broadband, things like that. So the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that the undercount in the 2010 census of American Indians and Alaska Natives was about 4.9%, which is substantially higher than Black Americans at 2.1% or Hispanic at 1.5%. We're comparing across different groups of people. So it's a very, I think, important question.
Thank you. And if you have some thoughts about concrete steps we can take to address this, I'd love to have you submit them in writing, and that's to any of our witnesses. I have a question for Mr. Shepard. Data is showing that it calls to 911 around the most economically disadvantaged Native American areas come from Native Americans that don't have reliable housing. So is it reasonable to assume that we can reduce some of the strain on our local public safety agencies by improving Native American housing?
Of course. That takes me back to the reauthorization of NAHASA also. We also want to recommend, if the opportunity arises, that NAHASA be authorized. Such formal reauthorization is long overdue. And if this should happen, we continue to join with most other tribes, CDHEs, and national and regional Native housing associations to advocate that the reauthorization modify the existing NAHASA 30% rental payment rule. If the country fails now to address the flight of Indian housing, it would be disastrous to tribes and Alaska Native communities, and to those hundreds of thousands of Native people and families who suffer so greatly with overcrowded and severely substandard housing.
Yeah. Well, it sure was a big issue in Wyoming during COVID. And so we learned a lot, all of us during COVID, about some of the soft underbelly of our supply chains, and certainly on our reservations, housing was a big issue. There was an incident, I'll tell you about it, on the Wind River Reservation, where an indigent Native American person was exhibiting symptoms of COVID, but he was in a park in a city, and they had to take him to the Indian Health Service in the back of a pickup because there were inadequate medical service providers, an ambulance that was subject to sterilization from COVID. We learned so much during COVID, and this is yet another area where we've got a lot of work to do. So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Ranking Member and Madam Chairman, I want to thank you once again for holding this hearing, and thank you very much to our witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Senator Lummis. I think we have time for another round of questions. If Senator Rounds would like to ask anything more, I would like to, and anybody else who's here, and I know that Senator Tester and Senator Ossoff are trying to get back, but have conflicts with other committees. So let me just go to my question. And I want to follow up on this USDA Loan 502 pilot program that Senator Rounds mentioned and I mentioned as well. And Aline, I'm going to direct this to you. I think you mentioned this in your testimony. So the USDA's 502 direct loan program offers single family home loans to low income rural households, but only about 2.6% of these loans go to Native families. And so the USDA established this pilot program in North and South Dakota where Native CDFIs could use their community-based networks to deploy these USDA mortgages. Aline, could you talk to us about sort of what we've learned from this, what impact? I'm looking at ways that we could expand this pilot nationally and would love to hear your thoughts on, what kind of where you think we should go from here with this.
Well, thank you, Senator. I think I mentioned in my testimony as well that I think some of the federal loan programs that are designed to provide mortgage financing on trust lands or just in general, and then the difficulty of actually providing those loans on trust lands, I think are present across multiple programs. And I think that same case applies in the 502 program. I think the pilot relending program, I think, provides a promising example of the way in which CDFIs can be leveraged to in community to serve more customers. And so in that example, you could see the relending increasing the total number of loans. I think it was 17 loans in 1 year versus 11 loans in the prior 11 years. And so it's really, you can see the power of the network. I think in that instance as well, the CDFIs provide financial education and other borrower support to make the program overall more successful. So I think there are promising examples there. I think, however, there are the kind of broader systemic issues that we had talked about earlier about issues relating to land, trust, the use of trust land, and then borrower lender knowledge of lending on trust land that I think is another avenue outside of CDFIs that continues to be an area of opportunity to look for solutions.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And let me just ask, maybe I'll just direct this broadly to the panel. As I've listened to your testimony today, you've each raised a number of really, practical and clear issues and ideas for where we can go from here. So let me just maybe ask each of you if there's anything more that you'd like to say. What is the single most important thing that we could do in your mind to addressing this lack of access to affordable housing and good quality housing that is such a deep challenge?
So if I may start, so this is a really interesting question. I think it gets to the idea that if the housing situation is becoming worse in Indian country or more challenging, we need to change the way that we're doing things. So taking a holistic approach, so the incentives are not lined up to have the capital markets come in. So I would love a question. I was tuned into the banking hearing yesterday for the CEOs of the banks. And the idea that the Community Reinvestment Act was passed last year and now it's on hold. But what are those banks doing to serve Indian country who are now squarely in their assessment area? What are their plans? And most of the large banks don't have plans on addressing Indian country, and they have no intention of doing that because it's more difficult. So we need to align the incentives of the capital markets to do business in Indian country. And I think the Community Reinvestment Act, the way that that has lined up, it gives Indian country as a distressed area the incentive that banks need to come in. They get multiples that are applied to doing business in Indian country so they can meet their CRA qualifications sooner. They also have the ability to invest in the banks that have learned to deal with Indian country. And they also can do equity investments and support CDFIs. And I think that those kind of incentives, when you're lining it up, and that kind of structure is really what we need on the incentive side. The support from the federal government in dealing with this one house at a time for, the USDA program is good to show banks the way. But when we're looking at this, the Title VI program shows the most promise because that program allows the tribe to leverage funds and develop housing developments instead of one house at a time. We should be supporting that and the other infrastructure that goes with it, and really supplementing that program on the community development block grants that we're leveraging. With 95% guarantees, tribes are still having trouble getting banks to come in and support that. And that it shows that it's not just the incentives. There has to be education on the banking side, who would love to have a 95% guarantee, but there's not always the education internally with the branches and the banks themselves to deal with Indian country. So looking at where the incentives are, looking at the role of the government in doing developments, and looking at bringing the capital markets in is really going to be instrumental in solving this in a general way instead of the looking at it one house at a time.
Right. Thank you. My time is up. I'm going to turn back to Senator Rounds, but I appreciate that very much, and I look forward to following up on that conversation. I think it's very important. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And once again, thanks for holding this hearing. And just so that our witnesses know, we've been called to a vote. And so we're probably gonna, and it's up to the chairperson, but it looks like we've got about 7 minutes left before the vote terminates on. So I'll be very brief. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being with us today. I do want to just touch base on the 184 HUD loan program, the guarantee program. We made some changes, and Senator Smith and I have worked on this in the past. And more specifically, we partnered together on legislation called the Native American Housing Affordability Act. It was signed into law as a part of the December omnibus. Our legislation made it easier for 184 borrowers on tribal trust land to participate in the 184 program by allowing HUD to issue certificates of guarantee without waiting on the trailing documents from the BIA, provided that lenders indemnify HUD for defaults. I'm hoping to get a better idea of how well these reforms have worked in the 6 months since they've become law. We may not have any evidence yet at all of success, but I was hoping that perhaps there might have been some sort of an uptick in lending, and I just thought I would start just very briefly. Mr. Stevens, do you know anything about whether or not there has been any uptick at all based on the changes made?
Not yet, not that I've seen, but for us in New York, we were limited on the amount of lending agencies that offered the 184 program. At one point within the last year, we had nobody available to us. We just got recently, because we had applied recently about 3 years ago, working with a company, then they were told that New York State refused to do 184. So now we're back to that, and we do have a couple companies that we're working with right now to do 184 in New York State. So it's a different issue too with the land issue that we have in New York State versus other tribal areas too. So it's going to be a little tweaking that we have to do to really make sure that we can get that program up and running. And we are working with one of the lending agencies now to do that. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Chermoff, I'm just curious, from at the Fed there, have you heard anything? Have you seen anything with regard to that, the changes that we've made?
Senator, we have not, and that's actually an area that we would love to work with others on, is just the availability of data on these programs so that we can, continue to monitor and track progress of availability and where the loans are being used, for example.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair, I know that we're pressed for time on this, so I'll yield back at this time, but I just want to say, once again, thanks for holding this. I think we can put together some good programs, and I think this is something that all of us want to try to address and make improvements on. If it was easy, it would have been done a long time ago. There's lots of intricacies on it. There's lots of issues with regard to tribal trust. The challenges that we face just in terms of the amount of poverty that we find to begin with. But this is something that I think this is an area that truly can make a difference for individuals that really could use some help. So, Madam Chair, thanks, and I will yield back.
Thank you so much, Senator Rounds, and thank you so much to all of our witnesses for being a part of this subcommittee hearing today, and for providing your testimony. I want to just note that both Senator Rounds and I serve also on the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and so we have an opportunity to work on these issues in both places here. And I know we've been listening hard around issues around reauthorizing the Usda, as well as the other very great and specific ideas that you all have offered today. For senators who would wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today, which will be Thursday, June 3rd. And for all of our witnesses, you have 45 days to respond to any questions for the record.